Okay, so today we're going to talk about risk and how to create risk matrices. It's probably easiest to go through this with your team around, especially risk managers. So I'd advise that before you head through this that you sit or get together with your team. Normally, if we did this in class, I'd just have you sit with your team, obviously. Additionally, feel free to download these slides ahead of time. They're already up on Sakai, so you can follow along with me. So today we're going to start our risk assessment. Earlier in the semester we talked about risk-based design, and today we're actually going to implement creating a risk matrix in Greenlight as part of your homework. So today we're just going to briefly sort of refresh ourselves on risk, some of the terms and definitions associated with it, a little bit about the right time to begin risk assessment, as well as the steps of actually doing risk assessment. And then as part of that, I'm going to walk you through the creation of a risk acceptability matrix in Greenlight, and then creating a risk table. And we're going to go through and add hazards, foreseeable events, hazardous situations, and harms in Greenlight. So just a refresher from last time, risk is the combination of probability and severity of harms. So you may recall from that first lecture, I kind of drew that little chart up that showed on one axis the probability of an event occurring, on the other one the severity of the event. And for you as medical device designers, it should be pretty obvious that the reason this matters is that if you're planning to put your device in a human or have it interact with a human, you want it to be safe. So, I mean, obviously, in addition to that, the regulating bodies across the world require some sort of risk management. And the standard that's associated with that is ISO 14971 and is specifically called out in 13485 as well. Just as a refresher, 13485 is the standard that refers to medical device quality management systems, and 14971 is specifically the application of risk management to medical devices. I'm not going to go through these terms. You can read them on your own. But what I am going to do is focus on risk assessment, which is the combination of analysis and evaluation, which I'll define on the next page, and walk you through these. So risk analysis is basically the process of identifying and figuring out the potential risks associated with normal use or foreseeable misuse. The thing about medical devices is there's always a risk associated with them. This is true for devices and drugs and any kind of treatment. A physician or a clinician is always weighing the pros and cons of using a particular treatment, and the idea is that whatever they select, the risks are far outweighed by the benefits of the actual treatment. Risk evaluation is the process of comparing hazards from your risk analysis to the risk acceptability matrix to determine the appropriate risk reduction required. This doesn't mean a lot when you're staring at it, but basically, in short, in order to figure out whether or not a particular design control is required, risk evaluation is appropriate. The idea being that you'll take a look at whatever the harm is associated with use of the device and see how risky it is to actually, for that particular scenario to play out. Risk acceptability determines the thresholds for various levels of risk in a medical device, and usually these are determined by some sort of research. For those of you that are interested in where I got a lot of the material for today, in addition to some of the ultimate guides from Greenlight, as well as the biodesign textbook and some random regulatory reference, there is a helpful document that has been put out by the Global Harmonization Task Force. It's called Risk Management Principles and Activities within a QMS. And I've already put that up on Sakai, so if you're interested, you can pull that up as well. Most of these definitions are covered in there as well. So the question kind of ends up looming if we don't cover it now about when to begin risk assessment. And the short answer is, according to most bodies, the best place or the earliest place to begin risk assessment is as early as your design input phase. This is because at your design input phase, you're really starting to think about the quantitative aspects that go into your design and the features that it's going to include. And so as a result, it kind of makes sense to start predicting how each of those features could influence the risk associated with your device. So you're right at this phase right now, which is exactly why we're starting it. And as a reminder, the design input is sort of the second phase of the waterfall diagram, which is actually stolen from Canada. Actually, it's borrowed with permission. So let's walk through the steps of risk management. There are 4 ones that I'm going to cover today, 3 of which I'm going to cover in detail using Greenlight. So the first is to determine your risk levels. Risk levels refer to that risk matrix, and I'll show you what that looks like. The second is risk analysis. The third is risk evaluation. And fourth, which I'm not going to talk about much, is the risk control and monitoring. I'm just going to give you a little context for that in this class, but know that each of these steps is a large step, but the biggest of these is probably number 4 because it's sort of a continuing and ongoing step. So, to refresh yourselves on the terminology of risk analysis, we're going to need a few terms. The first is hazard. A hazard is a potential source of harm. And when we're talking about risk analysis for medical devices, usually this is like broad categories. So think like biological harm or mechanical energy or electrostatic discharge or electrical harm, these sorts of things. And I'll show you what that looks like in Greenlight in a moment when we get there. Foreseeable events are sequences of occurrences that can happen or lead to a hazardous situation. I'll use the example of a surgical stapler here. So I'm going to categorize the following as a biological or a mechanical hazard. It can be both. Imagine that you have a surgical stapler that involves sort of like a trigger mechanism that you have to squeeze in order to actually deploy a staple. So imagine for a moment that there's a pinch point in that surgical stapler where your glove could get caught. Now, let's say during normal use, a surgeon gets their glove caught and it tears. So this is the sequence of events that we're going to imagine happening. So the surgical stapler is being used and the glove of the surgeon gets caught. The hazardous situation that could arise from this is if the glove tears, which is part of this foreseeable events, the following hazardous situation could arise. The skin underneath the glove of the surgeon could be exposed, and if it's not properly sterilized or it's no longer aseptic, then the aseptic field of the surgical procedure could get contaminated with bacteria that could cause an infection. And so this is a hazardous situation. The patient may or may not end up with an infection, but this is a hazardous situation that could lead to an infection. And so a harm, which is physical injury or damage to the health of people or damage to property and environment, in this case, would be an infection that results from a bacterial contamination of the aseptic field, resulting from the foreseeable sequence of events where a surgeon gets their glove caught in the surgical stapler and it tears. So that's a quick refresher of terminology. So the first step in the risk assessment analysis process is to determine the risk levels, which is also known as creating your acceptability matrix. So in the background of the slide, you can see an example of an acceptability matrix. Let me show you how to do that in Greenlight. Quickly, I'm going to review the steps. The first is that you're going to figure out your acceptability matrix size. In Greenlight, you're given 3 options. It has to be a square matrix, first of all. So it's 3 by 3, 4 by 4, 5 by 5. It doesn't really matter what you choose for this class. I usually go with 5 by 5 because it's a little more granular. In Greenlight, you're going to create a risk acceptability matrix with the desired matrix size. If you're a Mac user like I am, you may have to zoom out using the Command- keys. The third step is going to be to establish your severity categories, which I'll show you in a minute, establishing your probability categories, and then figure out where the thresholds are for low, medium, and high risk categories. And for those categories, you're going to have to figure out which of them require risk-benefit analysis. So let me switch over to my Greenlight Guru simulator here to show you what this first step looks like. So I'm signed into my test environment here, and I'm going to go to this project that I'm working on. So for those of you that are starting this process, you're going to have to be a risk manager to do this. I'm going to be working under this example, and I'm going to go to the risk management tab. So if you're following along, go ahead and do the same thing. Sign into Greenlight, go to your project, and if you're the risk manager, click on risk management. That should bring up this window that asks you or prompts you to choose a severity and probability matrix configuration. For this one, I'm just going to choose 5 by 5. And it automatically generates things. Now, I'm a Mac user, and you can see that there's stuff that you can't quite see here. I'm going to go ahead and hit Command- a couple of times so that everybody can see this a little more clearly. Now, On the left-hand side here, we see the probability, and on the bottom you can see the severity. So first we're going to go through and establish our severity categories. I'm going to leave these named the way they are, but you could change them to whatever you'd like within reason. Down here you can see that we have some text that describes exactly what it means for a particular harm to be negligible. So no or negligible risk to a patient. Minor is slight customer inconvenience. Little to no effect on product performance, non-vital fault. So you can redefine this if you wanted to. Serious, major, and critical likewise follow. The key here is that you want these to be something that is easily assessed. So you don't want this to be too ambiguous. The way that I tend to recommend people make these kinds of scales is to start with the extremes and fill in the edges. So negligible basically means nothing happens. Critical means, death, life-threatening, irreversible, life-threatening injury or irreversible damage, permanent damage, that sort of stuff. And then everything in between is sort of scaled versions between those two. On the other axis, we've got probability here. I'm also not going to change these, but again, you're welcome to change these proportions. I want to point out something now, which is you are not going to be able to change this after you click Save and Continue here. So this is going to be the risk matrix that you are stuck with, for lack of a better term, for the rest of the semester. So it's worth your time to think through this now. If you're not sure how to do this or you're not sure how you want to set these up, I recommend spending some time with your team trying to figure that out. I'm actually not going to touch any of these categories because I think they're appropriate. And frankly, Greenlight is built on 14971, and so these are pretty safe bets. You notice here also that these categories can be adjusted. So this is the sort of second to last step in this procedure of creating a risk acceptability matrix. For example, if I felt that occasional and minor risk was actually a medium level, I could change it, and you can see that it changes this area to orange. Now you can choose to elect to have risk-benefit analysis required for any or all of these particular categories. I'm going to leave it as it is here, but if you want, you're welcome to deselect these risk-benefit analysis as long as you can justify it somewhere if you wanted to. I'm going to leave them selected though. Now, we're not going to talk about risk-benefit analysis in this class, so there's probably no value to actually requiring RBA for most of these. Just because it's not something that we're going to cover in this class. So once you've set up your risk acceptability matrix, you can go ahead and click Save and Continue. So now what this does is it brings you to the risk matrix, which is different from the acceptability matrix. If you want to view your acceptability matrix, all you have to do is click on this little icon with a graph and it'll bring it back up. So now you can see that here is the acceptability matrix that I have. And at this point, I can still edit it. You'll see that this edit button goes away shortly after you start adding elements to your risk control matrix. As just another quick example, I have another project that has a risk management tab. And if I click on this risk matrix, you can see that this risk matrix is locked. And part of the reason for that is because I have items in my risk matrix that are linked to that risk to the acceptability matrix. I'm going to go back to my other project. So now that you've created your risk acceptability matrix, it's time for us to start walking through the next step of risk analysis. So the next portion is risk analysis. So that's going to be adding risk items. So those are those hazards, foreseeable events, hazardous situations, and harms. So basically what I want you to do is, as a team, I want you to figure out one item to start with. Start with the potential harm. It's probably the easiest way to go about doing this. So like if I were doing that surgical stapler example, I would start by thinking, okay, imagine for a minute that the glove tears. So this is a hazard or hazardous situation. So the glove tears and contaminates the surgical field. The harm associated with that is an infection in the patient. So from our risk management table, we can create and add hazards, harms, foreseeable events, and hazardous situations, obviously not in that order. Now you can walk through this if you're following along on the slides. Basically, I'm going to show a demonstration of this now. So I'm going to click the plus button here, And let's pretend that we're working with the surgical stapler again. So I'm going to go ahead and click hazard. So the reason I'm clicking hazard, and you don't have to start here, by the way. The reason I'm going to click hazard is just because I already know that I'm dealing with a biological hazard. But if you wanted to, we could start with a hazardous situation, which might be an easier place for you to start if you're having a hard time with this. So a hazardous situation might be surgical glove tear causes exposure of patient to bacteria on hand. Okay, this doesn't necessarily cause a harm or guarantee a harm, but it is a hazardous situation. So if we wanted to start that there, we could. So we're here, so why not? So I'll click add set hazardous situation. It brings me to the details tab where I can link other items to it. For now, I'm going to close this. Note, I actually called out a different order of operations in my instructions over here. One thing I'm going to point out here, and that you may be sort of confused by, if you add a hazard, foreseeable event, or a harm without adding a hazardous situation, they may not show up here. Let me show you an example of this. So let me add a hazard, and what I'm going to do is I'm not going to link it to anything. So I'm going to pretend that I have an environmental hazard here for a moment. EM interference, I'm going to add the hazard, and I'm going to close this. You'll see that my hazard doesn't show up, but I get a little icon here that shows an unlinked hazard. So if you basically, what happens is that the hazardous situations column is the one that anchors the matrix. So until you add a hazardous situation and link items to it, you won't see them show up in the matrix. Very similar to the design controls. So let's go back to this hazardous situations. So right now I've got the hazardous situation of a surgical glove tear causes exposure of patient to bacteria on hand. Let me add the foreseeable event associated with that, which would be surgeon's glove gets caught in actuation mechanism for stapler handle. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and link that hazard to it here by just clicking on the link button right there. And I'm going to click add foreseeable event. Now at this point you could edit items. You could also see the hazardous situations and hazards that are linked to this set of foreseeable events. Oops, I actually did not mean to link the hazard. I'm going to link this hazardous situation, which is the surgical glove tears causes an exposure of patient to bacteria on the hand. And I'm just going to close this for now. So now you can see that my risk matrix here has a foreseeable event, which is the surgeon's glove gets caught, and the hazardous situation that arises from that is the surgical glove tear causes an exposure of the patient to bacteria in the hand. Now, I'm doing this sort of out of order, and frankly the order doesn't matter too much. I'm going to add the hazard associated with this, which is basically categorizing the type of hazard. Now, I want to point out something here, which is that there may be more than one hazard associated with a single set of foreseeable events, as well as a single set of hazardous situations. So, for example, a tear could be caused by an energy hazard, right? So this actually is a type of mechanical energy that causes a tear. So here we could have a moving parts hazard. So I'm going to add that hazard. I'm not going to link it. I'm going to show you what happens when you don't. So you can see now I've got two items here. I would like to link this hazard to the foreseeable event. So let me go back to my risk matrix. Oops. Come on, there we go. And I'm going to click on this foreseeable event, and I'm going to go to the hazards and link the energy hazards mechanical. So now you'll see it show up here. I'm also going to create another hazard because this one is actually also a biological hazard. And this will be we'll call this biocontamination. It might actually be considered inability to maintain hygienic safety. Let's leave it as that. So we'll add that hazard as well. I'm going to go ahead and link this to the surgeon's glove getting caught. Now you can see that there are two hazards associated with this sequence of events. And finally, you can add a harm, which I'm going to do quickly. and I'm going to write in the description, patient experiences surgical site infection that results in, well, we'll just say surgical site infection that results in immune response. Actually, I'm just going to leave it like that. And I'm going to link this to the hazardous situation. So when I add that harm, it then will show up here. Okay, so now I have a single line in my risk matrix. And what I would like you to do is I would like you to go through and continue adding other items. Now, once you've done that, you need to assign a severity and a probability. What we're going to do next is we're basically going to link the harms in this particular matrix to this acceptability matrix. Okay. The idea being that for each harm we can assign a risk, and as you recall from the definition of risk, which is a combination of severity and probability, when we add those two items to this harm, we should be able to show where it falls in this matrix right here. So let's take a look at that. How do we do this? So first, you can see here on the left that we have the ability to assign the frequency and the severity of this particular issue. So let's say that this is, this may happen occasionally. And let's say that for the sake of argument that this is, I would argue that this is a serious complication, right? Like if a surgeon's glove tears and that results in an infection, even though the probability may be relatively infrequent. Let's say our initial design is pretty garbage and has a high risk of catching a glove. So let's say that this is occasional. When I save and log this risk, it's going to, well, first of all, this is what happens the first time you add something. It's going to ask you to log and risk levels and lock the acceptability matrix. So this is what I was talking about before. This is your last chance to edit these two categories. Frankly, you shouldn't be editing these really once you create them anyway, unless there's like a typo. So I'm going to go ahead and accept these risks levels and lock the acceptability matrix. And now what that does is it locks that acceptability matrix, and also it assigns a risk level to this particular harm of medium. You can see that this is now orange. So there's a few things that this means. First of all, you can see the minus sign in the bottom right corner, and this indicates something very specific, which is that your design does not have a design control item linked to this, which we'll get to in a minute. More importantly, from the risk side of things, it means that we're going to have to do something to reduce the frequency or to reduce the probability or the severity of what's happening. But for now, we're just going to leave this here and move on to the next thing. So basically, for your risk matrix, you're going to populate this with as many possible harms and hazardous situations, foreseeable events and hazards that you can think of that are associated with your device. And when you think you're there, and once you've assigned severity and probability to each of those, then we'll go to the next step, which is evaluating the risk. And the idea here now is that, okay, maybe we know what the risks are and the harms are, and we know where they fall in terms of severity and probability. Now the question is, what are we going to do about it? And this is where design controls come in. So you've been populating the user needs and the design inputs columns of your design control matrix. And at the end of the day, you're going to have not only user needs and design inputs, you're also going to have design outputs. You're also going to have verification and validation steps that will link to the risk analysis matrix. And so what we're going to do is we're going to basically link each harm to the risk analysis matrix, and each harm then will also get linked to the design control matrix for the item that is meant to reduce the risk of whatever it is that harm is associated, or the harm that's associated with that risk. So here's how this works, and I'll show a demo of this in a moment. You're going to open the harm that you're interested in linking to the source or control. You're going to click on sources and controls, then click add source and control. After that, you're going to select and add the design input or the user need that's associated with the harm's source. If you don't have if there's a source that doesn't exist, it means that you might be missing a design control item. So let's say that you have a foreseeable harm that you have included in your risk matrix, but there's really not a design control to help mitigate it, then if it falls into a medium or high risk category, you may need to add another design control item to make sure that your risk matrix ends up being properly managed. It is not an excuse to just leave it out. So let me show you what this looks like and where this comes in. I'll show you what this looks like in a moment. So I'm going to switch to a different example. Oops, really quickly. Let's go to product development. I've got this other product that I've worked on, and you can see here that I have a set of I've got a risk matrix. The first one has already been managed. The second one has a harm associated with it. I'm actually going to update this to make this fall into a more serious category for a moment, just to show this as an example. Okay, so now this looks very much like the other risk matrix that we had. Now what I want to do is, you can see this minus sign right here in the bottom right corner. You can see a check mark in the one above it. Well, the check mark indicates that there is a design control item that is used to reduce or mitigate this risk. By the way, well, we'll talk about that in a minute. So I'm going to click on the harm that is unlinked, so ones that have a minus sign. And I'm going to click on sources and controls. And now you can see here that there are no design control elements or sources that are linked to this particular risk item. So I'm going to go ahead and click on sources and controls, add source and control. And the source type is basically where this is coming from. So this is either from a user need or a design input. Typically, I'm finding that most of these come from a design input. So I'm going to click design input. And this happens to be a surgical stapler. And as an example, I have a design input that says the instructions must provide a description and warning about pinch points associated with its device. And then it defines what the pinch point is. So you can see here that a design control could be an instruction, a component of your instructions. Now, I want to point out here that this design input is like a specification, basically saying, hey, the instructions need to include some sort of warning about this. Now, the control type is going to be a design output or a verification step, if you're talking about linking to design input. If this were a user need, then it would say design validation over here on this side of things. But we're going to use a design output. Actually, we're going to use a design. We're going to link two things. We're going to link a design output and a design verification step to this. So we'll start with a design output, and I happen to have created a design output, which is the actual user manual itself. And so I would say, hey, there's a user manual section. Here's the section. It's attached here. So let me select that design output item and add the control. I'm also going to link the verification step, which happens to be that we're going to double check that the user manual contains a section about the pinch point risks and makes recommendations about mitigating pinch point risks. So I can add two design controls associated with a single source. So I'm going to click on add source and controls. And what this does is it actually unlocks this section here and allows me to lower the probability, for example. So let's say that previously my design, when it wasn't linked to some control item, landed in this occasional and serious category. And I found through some verification step that, this pinch happened pretty frequently. So I went back and decided to add a design control item, which was the instruction manual component. And so let's say after I add the instruction manual, I find that the frequency at which the pinch actually occurs is decreased, which, by the way, if you're going to decrease any of these two items, the severity or probability, you're probably not going to change the severity of a failure, for example, or even a risk. Why? Because if your glove gets pinched and torn, it's still likely to result in an infection, and the infection severity is not likely to change. But if you can change the frequency, i.e. lower the number of times that a pinch occurs to cause a tear in the first place, you're also reducing risk. So what we find is that most frequently, when you're mitigating risk, design controls tend to affect the probability rather than severity. And in my case, I'm going to assume the same, and I'm going to say, you know what, this is actually moving the severity, the probability down by an order of magnitude, and now it is remote. So I can click save and log, and this will turn the design control item green. So I'm going to click on the X, and oops, one thing I forgot to show you. So now we can choose the risk acceptance. So what I just did here in the corner is called residual risk. So once you've added your control, if it reduces the probability of the event occurring, whatever the remaining risk level, which in this case is low, that is called your residual risk. And as mentioned previously, there's always risks associated with any medical device, even when it's used correctly. So let's say for some reason this fell into a higher risk category, like medium or even high. And even after all my design controls, I found that the probability and severity didn't really change the risk category down. Well, in that case, I'd probably have to perform a risk-benefit analysis. The idea of a risk-benefit analysis is basically, without going into too much detail, you're going to test and make some argument for the risk associated with that device being worth it. So let's say that this is a life-saving device and that the risk of failure was, or the harm associated with like a lead failure of a cardiac pacemaker, the harm is pretty high. And the risk may be, medium associated with a lead failure, but, it's better than not having the pacemaker in the first place, which would be no leads at all. And so you would probably make that argument in some sort of risk-benefit analysis document that gets signed off by the right people and included as a report under the RBA. So if your residual risk ends up being higher than you expect, then you may need to do a risk-benefit analysis. But our residual risk here is low because we reduce the probability by adding some design controls. And so I'm going to go ahead and accept this risk with design controls. Note that you can't just willy-nilly go in here and accept your risk, even after you've added your design controls, if you don't know objectively that you've actually reduced the probability or severity of this particular risk. Okay. Once I have accepted the risk, you'll see that this checkbox pops up here, indicating that this harm is now linked to our risk matrix and that the risk has been mitigated. If you want to see where these different harms fall in the risk matrix, you can click on the acceptability matrix and you can see where they are located. And if you click on them, you can see which harm is associated with it. So you can see here that there is one that falls into the remote category with serious implications and another one that falls into the improbable category with serious implications. Obviously, clustering in the bottom left corner is desirable as opposed to the top right corner, which obviously you don't want to end up here. If you happen to have a bunch that are up here, then there's two options, right? You have to do a risk-benefit analysis, or you need to implement some design control item that reduces the probability or severity of that risk. So that's all about how you're going to do risk analysis and risk evaluation. So basically what I've highlighted on this slide is once you've created those risk items and linked them, you can connect them to the design control matrix. And if your residual risk is acceptable, then you can accept the risk. Otherwise, you may need to do a risk-benefit analysis. And as a reminder, again, if a design control doesn't exist, it probably means you need to add a design control item. Just like if the source of your harm doesn't exist in your design control matrix, you may need to add a design input or user need. So you've done your risk matrix, you've done a bunch of design controls to help lower the risk where possible, or you've done risk-benefit analysis. Where do you go from there? So risk control and monitoring is the last step, or the last sort of consensus step in the whole risk evaluation process, or risk assessment, I should say. It means a ton. In this class, though, it basically is going to refer to how you handle the residual risk. A company, this would have implications about management and auditing and all sorts of, so there's something called CAPA, which is basically involves continuous monitoring and improvement. It's preventative action is what it is. And so in this class, though, we're not going to get into those weeds. Basically, once you've created a risk matrix, you'll have a bunch of baseline risk to begin with. So you create all your hazardous situations, foreseeable events and harms, and then you you map them with severity and probability onto your acceptability matrix, and then from there you link your design control items and sources to that particular harm. So you're left with a bunch of elements that fall in this acceptability matrix. And basically, as you complete your verification and validation steps, you can mark them as complete. And then you can go back to the associated harm and fill in your residual risk. So, let's say that you put in a design control item, which is the requirement for an instruction manual that includes some warning about pinch points, right? And the idea being that you're reducing probability. Well, you have to demonstrate that you've done that and that the actual output satisfies the reduction in probability. And once you know that, you can go back to your risk matrix and fill in the residual risk. So if you reduce the probability, then you change the probability category. If your residual risk is still high, then obviously you need to update your design controls. Sometimes that's not feasible, right? Sometimes it's too late in the design process to actually go back and feasibly do your design control. Or if the design of your device is such that changing that particular element of it would either completely compromise the device itself, your intellectual property, or the actual functionality of the device, or create some other risk, it may just not be an option. And so in that case, you're sort of stuck with two options. Either you abandon it, right? Or you perform a risk-benefit analysis. If your RBA fails and you find that really it's not worth it, then you're kind of back to the drawing board. But the point here is that you've gone through some rigorous technique for assessing whether or not your device is safe. The idea, of course, at the end of the day is that these devices are going to get used in humans, and their safety is of utmost importance. So this is how risk control is linked back to your design control matrix, and how risk-based design is really a very crucial component of medical device innovation. I know this is a lot to take in, and so if you do have any questions, you're free to email me. You got my email address. I'm sure there will be questions about how to do this, but your homework assignment that's going to be coming down the pike here fairly shortly is going to be to fill out that risk matrix and link each harm back to your design control matrix. It's really going to force you to think through the way that your design controls are handled, and I think it's going to start forcing you into creating all the different elements of your design control matrix. In future talks, we're going to talk about design outputs, verification, and validation steps and what the differences between those are. And that'll help you out with those particular components of your design control matrix. But for now, I'd like you to focus on risk assessment, or I should say risk evaluation. And if you do have any questions, feel free to reach out.